On May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home from a party in Canby, Minnesota, when his car slid into a ditch on a rural road. It was around 1:15 a.m. when he called his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, asking for help. Brandon told his parents he was near Lind, about 10 miles from their home in Marshall. His father immediately got in the car to find him, but when Brian arrived at the location Brandon described, there was no sign of his son or his car. For the next 47 minutes, Brandon stayed on the phone with his father, trying to guide him to the right location. Brandon could see lights in the distance that he thought were from Lind, so he decided to walk toward them while staying on the phone. At 2:30 a.m., Brandon suddenly said, "Oh shit," and the line went dead. His father called back immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. They never heard from Brandon again. The next morning, search teams found Brandon's car in a completely different location, near Taunton, about 25 miles from where he said he was. The car was in a ditch, but it wasn't damaged enough to prevent him from driving. The keys were missing. What makes this case particularly unsettling is what investigators discovered about Brandon's final location. Cell phone records showed that when the call ended, Brandon was near the Yellow Medicine River. The area where he was walking was filled with steep riverbanks and dense brush, terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate safely in the dark. But here's what's truly chilling. Extensive searches involving hundreds of volunteers, search dogs, and aircraft found absolutely no trace of Brandon. Not a single piece of clothing, not a footprint, nothing. It's as if he vanished into thin air. Some investigators believe Brandon may have fallen into the river and drowned, but the river was searched extensively, including areas downstream where a body would likely surface. Others point to the fact that Brandon was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the area well. The strangest part? Brandon's last words, "Oh shit," suggest he saw or encountered something unexpected. But what could have startled him so badly that he would exclaim and then immediately disappear without another word? Brandon Swanson's disappearance remains one of Minnesota's most baffling missing persons cases. His parents continue to search for answers, but after more than 15 years, Brandon's fate remains a complete mystery. The case led to the creation of Brandon's Law in Minnesota, which requires law enforcement to immediately begin searching for missing adults under certain circumstances. On March 31, 1922, 6 people were brutally murdered at the Hinterkaifeck farmstead in Bavaria, Germany. This case remains one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in German history, made even more terrifying by the strange events that preceded the killings. The victims were Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, her 2 children Cecilia and Joseph, and the family's new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only started working there that very day. What makes this case particularly chilling is what happened in the days leading up to the murders. Andreas Gruber had been telling neighbours about disturbing incidents around the farm. He found footprints in the snow leading from the forest to his house, but no footprints leading away. He heard footsteps in the attic at night, but when he investigated, he found nothing. Even more unsettling, Andreas discovered that someone had been reading his newspapers. He would find them in different positions than where he left them, and sometimes papers were missing entirely. keys went missing and then reappeared in strange places. The family's previous maid had quit 6 months earlier, claiming the house was haunted. She said she heard voices and footsteps when no one else was around. The new maid, Maria, was supposed to start work on March 31st, the very day of the murders. On the day of the killings, neighbours noticed that no smoke was coming from the farmhouse chimney, which was unusual. When they investigated, they made a horrifying discovery. 4 of the victims, Andreas, his wife, daughter, and granddaughter, were found in the barn, killed with what appeared to be a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe. The killer had lured them to the barn one by one and murdered them. The 2-year-old Joseph and the maid Maria were found dead in the house. But here's what makes this case truly terrifying. Evidence suggests the killer remained in the house for several days after the murders. Neighbours had seen smoke from the chimney, and food from the kitchen had been eaten. The livestock had been fed and cared for. Someone was living in the house with the dead bodies. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details. The killer had carefully stacked the bodies in the barn and covered them with hay and straw. In the house, the killer had apparently eaten meals and slept in the beds. Police questioned over 100 suspects, but no one was ever charged. The case was officially closed in 1955, but the murders remain unsolved to this day. Some theories suggest the killer was someone who knew the family well, perhaps a relative or neighbour. Others believe it was a stranger who had been watching the family for months, which would explain the mysterious signs Andreas had noticed. The Hinterkaifeck case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and films. The farmstead was demolished in 1923, but the location remains a source of fascination and fear for people interested in true crime. What makes this case so haunting is the premeditation and the killer's apparent comfort with remaining at the scene. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was carefully planned and executed by someone who felt no urgency to leave. On the night of April 11th, 1981, in the small resort town of Keddie, California, one of the most brutal and baffling quadruple murders in American history took place. What happened in Cabin 28 that night continues to haunt investigators and the local community more than 40 years later. The Sharp family had been living in Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort, a collection of small cabins in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old single mother, lived there with her 5 children after recently divorcing her husband. The family had moved to Keddie seeking a fresh start and a peaceful place to rebuild their lives. On that April evening, Sue was home with her sons John, 15, and Rick, 10, along with her youngest daughter, Tina, 12. Her other children were staying elsewhere. John had invited his friend Dana Wingate, 17, to spend the night. What happened next would turn Cabin 28 into a house of horrors. The next morning, Sue's 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, returned home from a sleepover. What she found when she opened the door would traumatize her for life. In the main room of the cabin, she discovered the bodies of her mother Sue, her brother John, and Dana Wingate. All 3 had been brutally murdered. The scene was beyond horrific. The victims had been bound with medical tape and electrical cord, then beaten and stabbed repeatedly. The weapons used included a hammer, kitchen knife, and what appeared to be a steak knife. The violence was so extreme that investigators initially thought it might have been the work of multiple attackers. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the crime was what was missing. Sue's 12-year-old daughter, Tina, was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of her in the cabin, and no indication of what had happened to her. Even more chilling, Sue's 10-year-old son, Rick, and his friend were found unharmed in a bedroom adjacent to where the murders took place. They claimed they had slept through the entire attack, which seemed impossible given the violence that had occurred just feet away from them. The investigation that followed was plagued with problems from the beginning. The crime scene was contaminated, evidence was mishandled, and potential suspects were overlooked. Local law enforcement seemed overwhelmed by the brutality and complexity of the case. 3 years later, in 1984, Tina's remains were found in a remote area about 100 miles from Keddie. She had been murdered, but the condition of her remains made it impossible to determine exactly how or when she died. Over the years, several suspects emerged. 2 men, Martin Smart and John Beau Boubaid, who had been living in a nearby cabin, became prime suspects. Smart had been heard making threatening statements about Sue Sharp, and both men had suspicious behavior around the time of the murders. However, both died before they could be charged, Smart in 2000 and Boubaid in 1988. What makes this case particularly unsettling is the level of rage and brutality involved. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, or a random attack. This was personal. Someone wanted to inflict maximum pain and suffering on the Sharp family. Recent developments have brought new hope to the case. In 2016, investigators announced they had new evidence, including DNA profiles from tape found at the crime scene. They believe this DNA matches a living suspect, though no arrests have been made. The case has had a lasting impact on the community of Keddie. Cabin 28 was eventually demolished in 2004, but locals still whisper about the murders. Many residents from that time have moved away, unable to live with the memories of what happened. The Keddie cabin murders remain one of California's most notorious unsolved cases. The brutality of the crime, combined with the mysterious circumstances and the decades of unanswered questions, continue to fascinate and horrify those who learn about it. For the surviving family members, the lack of closure has been devastating. They continue to seek answers and justice for Sue, John, Tina, and Dana, hoping that someday someone will finally be held accountable for the nightmare that unfolded in Cabin 28.